Hey 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 hey. This podcast is brought to you by the Be Heard Project on behalf of the Unique Get Together Society and explores Indigenous experiences of racism in the Kingston General and Hotel Dieu hospitals in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. While it begins with a history that supports your understanding of the larger context, the stories themselves speak volumes, amplifying the voices of Indigenous peoples in Kingston. Finally, the recommendations for change that emerge are critical to supporting the elimination of racism in the Kingston hospital system today. We begin this story with the historical context of Indigenous health in Canada. Indigenous people were very healthy prior to contact with Europeans. However, British and Canadian governments did little to prevent widespread death due to epidemics. It was assumed that Indigenous peoples would eventually die out and the land would be free for the taking. The settler colonial process was itself rooted in the doctrine of discovery, the belief that Europeans are entitled to claim the lands of non-Europeans. White supremacy in settler nations is the presumed superiority of white racial identities in support of the cultural, political, and economic domination of non-white groups. A way of looking at that is that privilege and racism are the symptoms, while white supremacy is the disease. It is the basis of anti-Indigenous racism. Canada, as a settler nation, was established with the goal of creating a white nation, and the land appropriated from Indigenous peoples would be occupied only by white Europeans, and that Indigenous peoples would be excluded from all aspects of society being built on their lands. In 1885, John A. Macdonald, who was the first Prime Minister of Canada, said, "If you look around the world, you will see that the Aryan races will not wholesomely amalgamate with the Africans or Asiatics. It is not to be desired that they should come, that we should have a mongrel race, that the Aryan character of the future of British America should be destroyed by a cross or crosses of that kind." This idea of exclusion involved a calculated disregard for Indigenous life, which has been central to the massive health crisis that the colonial process brought to Indigenous peoples. While some of the particularly virulent diseases brought to Turtle Island resulted in widespread deaths of Indigenous peoples during the earliest colonial period, the wider background to Indigenous vulnerability to disease resulted from Canada refusing to provide food for those whose lands had been taken or whose food resources had been deliberately destroyed. It was the resulting widespread starvation that resulted in most of the massive epidemics that have raged through Indigenous communities. The tuberculosis epidemic, which decimated Indigenous peoples across the prairies, was related to starvation after the extermination of the buffalo, coupled with the Canadian military and state-making pressures to eradicate Indigenous national patterns of living. Instead, it was attributed to Indigenous peoples' innate racial susceptibility. Indigenous peoples are not more vulnerable to disease. Rather, starvation and disease were foundational aspects of Canadian state building. Canada's callous refusal to offer assistance even when cures were available for certain epidemics has been a reality in Canada. Tuberculosis continued to ravage Indigenous communities in the 30s, long after whites had been inoculated against tuberculosis and were x-rayed regularly. When white Canadians got tuberculosis, they were sent to modern sanitaria, where they were cured. Indigenous people were denied vaccines, were seldom x-rayed, and went to church-led preventaria, where only bed rest was prescribed, because Indian Affairs did not want to pay for treatments. The complete failure to address TB among Indigenous peoples by the then Department of Indian Affairs led to massive loss of life. The complete disinterest on the part of Canada to the health of Indigenous peoples under their control is made clear by the Inuit tuberculosis epidemic of the 50s and 60s, where at least 1/3 of all Inuit were infected. Building a hospital in the north to enable Inuit peoples to access health care was never considered. Instead, by 1956, 1/7 of the entire Inuit population was being treated in southern Canada. The average length of stay was 2.5 years, and some patients stayed much longer. Many families were not notified when a TB patient died in the south. The dead were buried in pauper graves in a southern cemetery paid for by the Department of Indian Affairs. Adequate health care, even in Northern Ontario today, continues to be denied. Residential schools were another site of disease and mass death for Indigenous peoples. By 1907, 24% of all Indigenous children attending residential schools had died from tuberculosis. Indigenous children were also used as guinea pigs for research that was performed on them. One set of experiments involved the testing of tuberculosis vaccines on them. Several deaths occurred among those tested, yet the vaccine that was developed were not provided for Indigenous peoples for decades after they were provided for whites. Education was an essential avenue in constructing anti-Indigenous racism by promoting a state narrative and eliminating any knowledge of Indigenous peoples. This narrative led to widespread ignorance of Indigenous peoples, as well as complete callousness by those involved in Indian administration towards what amounted to mass death among Indigenous peoples. Part of the narrative that supported European acquisition of Indigenous lands was that Indigenous peoples would inevitably die off. But here we are in 2021, and we're still here. Long after the belief in our inevitable decline has been proven false, the sources of modern Indigenous diseases, especially diabetes, has continued to be blamed on Indigenous peoples for their own weaknesses, rather than targeting systems that have destroyed traditional foods and monopolies that make good food so expensive that Indigenous peoples are forced to rely on cheap, starchy, and sugar-laden foods. By the 1960s, the skyrocketing rate of diabetes in Indigenous communities was being theorized by Dr. James Neal as being caused by the notion of a thrifty gene. Neal viewed Indigenous peoples as so-called primitive hunter-gatherers whose bodies were conditioned for food shortages and so have become metabolically thrifty in terms of food intake. He abandoned this theory through lack of sound evidence in the mid-1980s, yet his idea of a genetic predisposition to diabetes remains steadfast in Canadian health discourse. Yet again, Indigenous poor health is blamed on Indigenous peoples themselves, partly due to their genetics and partly because of their so-called choice to live sedentary lifestyles. This completely discounts the reality of land and lifestyle loss forced on Indigenous peoples by the Canadian state. Loss of land limits traditional food use and forces dependency on Western diets that are healthy for no one. Today, tuberculosis among Inuit people in Nunavut remains at rates comparable to third world contexts. Several factors, mostly socioeconomic, account for this rate of infection, due to overcrowded housing, malnutrition related to poverty, and inadequate access to health care. To top it off, many Inuit do not feel safe attending an outpost health center or hospital staffed by non-Indigenous people due to the racism they experience. When looking at anti-Indigenous racism from healthcare professionals, it's important to maintain an understanding of white supremacy as something that is perpetuated in contemporary society through the education system and the media. Broad-based ignorance about racism and the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada is one of the ways that racism is held in place, as there is very little in our education system and the media to contradict these beliefs. Current education narrates a nationalist identity, which acts as a form of propaganda. It includes many stereotypes about Indigenous peoples and histories that have become ingrained in citizens' consciousness, establishing the basis for flawed understandings. Since members of the healthcare profession are drawn from citizens at large, they are burdened by these ideas systemic in education and society. Racist stereotypes of Indigenous people spring from the existing roots of colonial attitudes and beliefs constructed through white supremacist viewpoints. This leads to racism manifest in healthcare and other state institutions, which causes such harm and suffering to Indigenous peoples. Racism is often understood as interpersonal racism, such as that between two individuals. However, interpersonal racism perpetuates systemic racism, which is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization. Despite growing research highlighting the mistreatment of Indigenous people in healthcare, healthcare administrators and frontline staff still deny that racism in healthcare is a determinant in Indigenous people's health. One effect of racism is the stress that arises when Indigenous peoples experience racist interactions. Research has shown that Indigenous patients are known to strategize on how to manage racism before seeking care in the emergency room. A recent example of racist stereotyping was the treatment of Joyce Echequan in the hospital in Joliet, Quebec. Joyce had frequently visited the hospital for many years with heart complications. Because she had a distrust of medical staff and not being fluent in French, she would record Facebook Live videos during her hospital visits and have a cousin translate for her. On September 26, 2020, she was admitted for stomach pains. There she was restrained to her bed and given morphine, despite her protests that she would have a bad reaction. She live-streamed for 7 minutes that day. During the live stream, at least 2 hospital employees are heard insulting her. While she was moaning in pain, an employee asked her if she was done acting stupid. She was also told that she is only good for sex. The employees were the ones paying for this, and that she was stupid as hell. She died later that day. According to her family, she was allergic to morphine. These kinds of stereotyping and racist treatment are all too common experiences for Indigenous people. As we can see from the interviews conducted with Indigenous peoples in Kingston, who were asked about their experiences in the Kingston General and Hotel Dieu hospitals. 2 common assumptions that participants reported was that they were presumed to be intoxicated or have drinking problem. Patients requiring pain medication were presumed to have ulterior motives, like trying to obtain prescription drugs to use for non-medical purposes or to sell.
I had pain from slipping outside on the ice back in February. I managed by taking hot baths and icing it. A few nights in, I went to bed and I woke up in such severe pain that I couldn't even get up. I had to call an ambulance and a family member to come over and open the door for them when they got here. I went down to the hospital and I told them I was Indigenous and trans because they needed to know about my current medications, including testosterone. Afterwards, they placed me in a chair to wait in spite of my pain. After a wait, I was brought into a bed. The doctor who came to see me didn't even come in the room. She just poked her head in the door. She asked why I'd come into the emergency, and I told her the story of falling and the worsening of the pain to the point of not being able to get up. I asked if I could have some medications for the pain. Her first response was to deny me because of addictions issues. She asked me, "How much do you drink? Are you a drug user?" All those were the first questions she asked. Then I asked her for lorazepam because that's sometimes given to people for muscle spasms. She claimed again that the emergency department didn't carry any lorazepam and started talking about addiction issues. She kept citing addiction issues as to why she couldn't provide me pain medication. Finally, she conceded to give me some Tylenol with codeine. She literally overdosed me on codeine. The nurse even commented that this was the most codeine that they'd ever given someone at one time. After giving me codeine, the doctor decided to discharge me at 4 a.m. I had no shoes, no coat, no wallet. I was only wearing shorts and a t-shirt and little blue booty things they had given me. They were going to put me out in the freaking cold in February, even though I couldn't walk. I had no wallet, had my cell phone, and a set of keys.
This participant's family doctor later determined that he had 2 herniated discs. The fact that little assessment was carried out led to inappropriate care due to their assumptions about his character.
My auntie lived in Kingston for a while, and she had a bad fall at her home that broke her ribs. And because she's had 2 heart attacks, we called 911. When the ambulance got there, they were very concerned. At the hospital, it was the ambulance attendants who were arguing for her care because the nurses wanted to discharge her and discount her before even looking at her. She doesn't have a drug problem. But to white nurses, being native means you look like a drug addict. I've had the accusation leveled at me when I've been in for broken bones. If you go to the hospital in pain, they're going to ignore you because they think you're a drug addict. I don't know any single family member who hasn't had this experience.
One participant went to the Kingston General Hospital because she was intoxicated and was given no care at all. She had just had an increase in her antidepressant medications, and after a few drinks she started to black out. At her request, her friends took her to the hospital, as she was frightened and concerned that she would need her stomach pumped.
When I got to the ER, I couldn't remember much. I remember trying to explain that I was intoxicated and on antidepressants, but I'm not sure what came out then. I remember the triage nurse not being very friendly. I do remember that. I was really scared because I had never blacked out before. I knew something was very wrong, and I was trying to get help. I sat in the waiting room until the sun came up. I was there around midnight. By morning, I was starting to get more lucid and was very confused as to why I was never admitted. I thought I was going to have to get my stomach pumped or fluids, at least something. I remember when I was being triaged, she asked me for my health card, and I remember taking out my status card and asking if she needed it. She knew I was Indigenous, and she knew I was there because I was intoxicated. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I was never admitted. I just sat in the waiting room all night, so that was very troubling. I'm very lucky that something more serious did not happen to me because I was really afraid and I was seeking help and didn't get any. It's so disturbing that I had to come away from that situation wondering if the reason I wasn't served was because of racism.
Stereotypes about Indigenous peoples as prone to alcohol or substance use impact healthcare providers' attitudes about who is credible or deserving of care. Indigenous individuals who go to KGH or Hotel Dieu Hospital are repeatedly treated with disrespect based on assumptions of addiction. This shows the serious implications of pervasive settler ignorance and anti-Indigenous racism. Unacceptable personal interactions are another common experience. In this study, participants experienced condescending race-based attitudes or being talked down to as patients.
I don't have one particular story because the majority of staff in the ER that I've had to deal with have aggressive and condescending race-based attitudes towards myself. I've never gone into either hospital in any form, in any department alone because of that. It's been so much my experience that I'm going to be dismissed, ignored, or talked down to that I don't go to the hospital without either having a white or white presenting friend attend with me so I can lean on their privilege. Otherwise, doctors are talking down to you like you're stupid.
Another incident that occurred in the KGH operating room also demonstrates inappropriate assumptions and behavior on the part of the doctor. This patient was in for dental surgery. She recalls meeting with the anesthetist and going into the OR. She also recalls counting fairly far before she went under. After the surgery was over, she was informed that the surgery was successful. However, the anesthetist came over to talk to her and commented that there was concern because she woke a few times during the surgery. While the patient wasn't aware of this, the anesthetist was clearly angry and surmised due to the eczema on her arms that she was an intravenous drug user and that this was the cause of the difficulty in keeping her properly anesthetized.
I was sort of shocked to hear that. I had smoked weed like once in my life, but I was afraid because he seemed angry. He was like, "So, do you do drugs?" And I was like, "What kind?" I wanted to answer the question properly because I didn't want to admit that I'd smoked weed once, but I also wanted to be honest. He yelled at me, "Intravenous drugs," and pointed at my arms. I was like, "No." Then he was like, "What's on your arms?" "I have eczema." It's so common in Indigenous communities for people to have eczema, especially in Northern Ontario. And I was telling him, "No, this is eczema." And he was basically accusing me of having track marks and lying about being an intravenous drug user. He was very angry. Now, looking back and thinking more critically, I think it was pretty racist for someone to automatically assume intravenous drug use rather than looking at my file. Clearly, I have eczema. I've had it since I was 9 months old. It's not a new thing. He was also angry that maybe it made him look bad and that I'd been waking up. It might have been an ego thing for him, like, I'm going to punish this patient or find some reason why there was these issues with sedation.
The patient was shocked, sad, and angry that such an accusation was made of her in such a vulnerable position, still coming out of anesthesia. She was troubled that the doctor had implied that this was the reason he had difficulty keeping her under.
I asked the nurse, is there any other reason why people might have a hard time being sedated other than intravenous drug use? And she was like, oh yes, there's lots of reasons. I personally have anxiety, and so it's really hard for me to be sedated. I thanked her for saying that because I was on a very strong anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication at a very high level. They would have also been seen in my file and would have seen something the anesthetist would have had access to and would have known about. And so I think jumping to the conclusion that I was an intravenous drug user is not something that everyone gets. I think it had to do with my race.
Another concern is being asked questions that had no bearing on the care they needed and that were based on stereotypes.
I've had questions asked about my children. What's their actual blood quantum?
They accused me of being in incest with my boyfriend, that we were actually related.
Even Indigenous people who occupy academic positions and are very articulate cannot avoid experiences of racism.
During my first months of teaching at Queen's, when I was new to Kingston, I got a bad cold, which inflamed my asthma. As a result, one night I had to drive myself to the hospital to get treatment. I was put in a waiting room to get a Ventolin bag. I saw a young white man who arrived after me being treated down the hall while I was waiting. When my doctor finally came to see me, because he saw by my chart that I was a professor, he began talking about his experiences at the Moose Factory Hospital, asking me whether I had taught up there, and other questions about my academic work, even though I had been struggling to breathe for quite a while. When I finally interrupted him to ask for treatment, his whole attitude changed. He gave me a Ventolin bag and left me there for a long time. I saw how the nurses were paying attention to the young white man while he was on the Ventolin bag, and it felt very lonely to be sitting alone for hours, especially after the Ventolin did its work and I was able to breathe again. I sat there, almost until dawn, waiting for the doctor to return. When he did, he was very short with me and wrote me a prescription for more of the steroid spray that I use for asthma, and a prescription for 1 Ventolin inhaler, which is important for emergencies. I asked him if he could give me another Ventolin since it's winter and the cold brings on my asthma, and he refused. He told me, very abruptly, that Native people always misuse Ventolin. They take it instead of relying on the steroid spray to control their asthma. Ventolin shouldn't be used to control your asthma. The steroid spray should. I was speechless. Here I was, a professor at Queen's, and he refused to issue me a second inhaler because I was bound to misuse them, because I was Native. A day later, I slipped and fell, and my only Ventolin inhaler fell out of my pocket into a snowdrift. As I scrabbled around on my hands and knees looking for it, and trying not to panic, which would bring on another asthma attack, I vowed that I would never go to KGH again. I found a family doctor instead, who I relied on to treat my asthma.
All of the questions these patients were subjected to were inappropriate and demonstrate ignorance and disrespect leveled against patients. Such questions and treatments suggest that patients are somehow responsible for their own health issues. Another expression of disrespect was demonstrated in another example reported by the person who accompanied the patient, where an Indigenous trans person accessed the hospital and was subject to the use of his dead name, his birth name, indicating his previous gender.
I accompanied a patient to UCC, and this patient still had his dead name on his card. The nurse literally under her breath gave a cough and used the dead name for them to come see the doctor. I was shocked that the nurse had been corrected once, but continued to use that dead name just as a way to give a little dig like, I don't approve of your lifestyle, or I don't approve of you or your people.
Another common experience of Indigenous patients is that patients are irresponsible or non-compliant. Patients are seen as unwilling to take responsibility for their health care or follow through on aftercare instructions. In one instance, a parent with an Indigenous child asked the staff to respect the child's desire for a moment to prepare himself as they were giving him stitches.
One time when I took a child in, he needed stitches, and I insisted that they respect listening to him when he needed a minute to prepare himself. The end result was that they said, well, if you make us wait, we're not going to be able to finish giving him care.
This intentional disregard for an Indigenous child's needs while receiving care was acutely disrespectful. The parent was no doubt seen as lacking the capability to take responsibility for the child's health care. When microaggressions lead to patient anger towards healthcare staff, care is withheld or inadequate, placing blame on the patient rather than where it's due on the healthcare workers who are perpetuating microaggressions.
To some degree, my approach when I see microaggressions is to not letting it build up into multiple microaggressions, but just straight up calling them the racist motherfuckers they are. It throws them off enough that they will either be worse, or in their discomfort, they will tell you to shut up, which is useful. I think mostly they respond by ignoring me or telling me I'm overreacting.
There was a time I wrote a letter about a patient who had a racial incident. Absolutely racism is what happened to that young man. The letter resulted in questions being asked, and they all decided that he was just a jerk and he got treated the way he should have been treated.
Placing blame on the victim of abuse and using this as an excuse for poor delivery of care is based on a lack of understanding and knowledge and ignorance about the impacts of microaggressions. One patient described a bizarre and traumatic incidence of forced attendance at the hospital based on the stereotype of a government worker and being kept in a locked ward under the belief that she was suicidal.
I was struggling with a member of a government service on an unrelated issue who decided, based on my reaction to him, that I was suicidal, which I was not. I was taken against my will to KGH. I identified as Indigenous and asked for an Indigenous social worker or elder to speak to. The hospital staff did not like the idea at all. They kept trying to make me talk to a mainstream social worker. I kept asking for an Indigenous one. The whole time this was occurring, I was locked in a room with a police guard. After 2 hours of sitting by myself in the room, a social worker came in, told me there were no Indigenous people to talk to, and asked that I speak to her. When I refused, I was asked to leave the hospital because there was nothing they could do for me. So what was the point of traumatizing me in the first place? It's a good thing I wasn't actually suicidal.
Another incident occurred when an elderly man repeatedly went to the Kingston General Hospital ER, having a hard time breathing and with his balance off. He was sent home saying there was nothing wrong with him. Finally, he returned again and was admitted. In 2 hours, he had passed away. Hospital staff told the family the cause of death was natural causes.
We found out from our family doctor, who received a report from the hospital, that he had an infection in his lungs for the past 3 months.
One participant noted that the Hotel Dieu Hospital Urgent Care Center refused to treat her sister who had a broken arm due to the expiration on her health card. It wasn't until the participant sought the support of a political figure that her sister received the necessary treatment.
The other card was in the mail. It's not our fault that it was taking a long time because of COVID, but once you say you're First Nations, it's an automatic switch off.
Yet another incident involved an older woman who had had a heart attack. Because she had complicated medical needs due to cancer and diabetes, she had a tube in her chest for dialysis. The sight of this tube was causing pain. When the family checked, the site was inflamed with green pus coming out of the area.
It was all red and there was green pus coming out of it, so I panicked. I went out in the hallway and said, "Listen, "You're not going to treat my mom like this. There's something wrong with that tube. Green pus is coming out of it."
The hospital staff responded by not checking the tube, but by asking her daughter to leave as she was causing a disruption.
It ended up that Mom caught a staph infection because they weren't tending to her dialysis tube. I got thrown out of the hospital because I made a ruckus. I had to sign a waiver saying I would not scream at the nurses. I screamed at the nurses because of that green pus.
Repeatedly, over the next few days, family members concerned for the patient's well-being were asked to leave. The woman who I spoke with also had bruises on her arms, which the woman said was due to the nurses squeezing her arm. The final issue this family faced was that upon entering the hospital, this patient had signed a do not resuscitate order.
Mom had a DNR put on when she first went into the hospital. She didn't want to be kept alive on a machine. When we weren't there, her heart stopped and they brought her back. They were supposed to call us. She flatlined again and they brought her back again. Overnight, Mom flatlined again and they put a machine on her and it was keeping her alive. I told them that she has a DNR and that she did not want this. Apparently, that night she'd flatlined 3 times and they brought her back. They didn't call us. I had to threaten to get my lawyer before they agreed to disconnect her from the machines. I don't understand why they did that to her.
These patients all accounted how they were disrespected, misdiagnosed, and mistreated in various ways, indicating a profound lack of concern for the well-being or even the very lives of their patients. Another report was about a patient who had a substance use disorder as a means of coping with mental health issues. She frequently went to Kingston General Hospital and Hotel Dieu Hospital for help. Family members also attended with her seeking help.
There was no help for my niece. KGH labeled her a frequent flyer. They basically ignored her the times I was with her and sent her away with no help. My beautiful niece is gone, despite repeated efforts to get help for her mental health, in addition to help for physical ailments. Even her sexual assault was ignored by police, FACS, and the hospital.
This points to the devastating consequences when care is not provided. Failing to treat and refer patients to proper care due to a substance issue discounts the real possibility that something is medically wrong and in need of treatment. Lastly is the issue of the relationship between hospitals and child and family services, which is completely absent in the literature on racism in healthcare, in part because it represents a form of racism that is deeply embedded in the colonial relationship between Indigenous peoples and the state. Birth alerts were also applied to children who went through the child welfare system, adoption, or foster care. These birth alerts applied to children, then took effect when the child grew up and had their own child. This ensures the system continues and is how the 60s scoop grew into the millennial scoop. It's important to provide some context relating to the devastating role that Children's Aid has played in Indigenous families. Provincial child welfare agencies' involvement with Indigenous children took shape particularly in the years following the Second World War. Before this, the federal government completely controlled Indigenous children, and residential schools became the place where orphaned children were sent since colonialism had attacked and undermined the extended families which would have previously cared for any children who were orphaned. At the time, intergenerational residential schooling created generations of children who had never been parented properly. In 1951, the Indian Act was amended through the General Law of Applicability, which applied provincial and territorial child welfare legislation on reserves. As the residential school system began to be phased out, beginning in the 1960s, responsibility for Indigenous child welfare shifted slowly to the child welfare system. Children were removed from neglect, but also from parents who were struggling to cope. Family assistance offered to white families that often prevented white children from being removed was denied under the Indian Act. The government would only pay for Indigenous child removal, not Indigenous family assistance. Large numbers were also removed simply because children were frequently being cared for by extended family members so that parents could work, or because structural racism made families poorer than white families. Any deviation from the white nuclear family was viewed as grounds for removal. Furthermore, discriminatory practices were embedded throughout the society. Teachers were required to call Children's Aid whenever an Indigenous child came to school poorly dressed for the climate, when white children were not subject to this rule. Children were apprehended at birth simply if the mother was not married. The practice of birth alerts, where Children's Aid would routinely call if an Indigenous mother was suspected of being unfit to raise a child for any reason, resulted in other apprehensions. The cumulative result was the removal of massive numbers of Indigenous children from their homes and communities, usually to be placed in non-Indigenous homes as foster children or adoptees. The period from the 1960s to the 1990s has been coined the 60s scoop. However, this period did not end, rather it continued as what is commonly now referred to as the millennial scoop. Indeed, there are more children in care now than there were in residential schools. It is commonly understood in Indigenous contexts that child welfare is fulfilling the same goal as residential schooling did, to destroy Indigenous families by removing the children and bringing them up in non-Indigenous environments. The results on the families and the children have been catastrophic. Most adoptions break down, and large numbers of adoptees have ended up in prison or losing their own children to child welfare. Loss of children has caused immense pain in almost every Indigenous family in some communities. Approximately 2/3 of Aboriginal inmates said they had been adopted or placed into foster or group homes at some point in their childhood. What leads to such problems? By relocating money from housing and infrastructure on reserve to child welfare services, the federal government negatively impacts on-reserve social programs. This creates a perverse cycle, transferring funds from housing, water, and sanitation to fill shortfalls in child welfare services heightens the risk of children needing these services in the first place, as poor housing is one of the key factors leading to First Nations children being removed from their families. Child welfare, therefore, must be understood as a form of racism entrenched in both historical and ongoing colonialism that has devastated Indigenous peoples' lives. This very real and dangerous linkage between hospitals and children and family services is still present today. Hospitals are in a unique position to assess families and to intercede by calling in reports to child and family services. This is a particular concern for Indigenous families. One incident was noted during the birth of a child. Due to the child being underweight, 5 pounds at birth, the mother was first accused of using marijuana and second of being in an incestuous relationship, and Child and Family Services was called. The mother allowed access to her medical records, which demonstrated that she had no prior drug use. However, it also showed that the mother had a mild intellectual disability. While Child and Family Services allowed her to have her first child, the second child was also underweight, and as a result, the child was taken into care. Child and Family Services argued that due to her intellectual disability, she could not parent 2 children.
They took my second child because I shared my medical records to prove I wasn't on marijuana. That's the stab in the back. Now they're keeping her because they say I can't handle 2 children because of my intellectual disability. It's not fair.
The following statements demonstrate the issues the mother faced when confronting the system.
It feels like if the doctor asks if you're a different culture, you're at risk. If they see your records, then they have an opinion about you. You can't switch doctors if you don't click, or you're risking your child. Now, it seems like you're discriminated because you're low income. Most Indigenous families are low income. She's still in the system and away from her family, all because of the doctors who made judgments of us.
It was later determined that the oldest child had a chromosomal abnormality, which could have been the cause of the low birth weight. However, Child and Family Services continues to pressure her to accept the loss of her second child in exchange for closing the case on the first. Doctors continue to participate by further accusing her of not eating enough as a reason why both children's birth weights were so small. It's as simple as negative judgments that are made about the capacity of patients to care for their children. Another respondent stated that when child welfare took her from her family, her health was assessed at Kingston General Hospital before being passed on to her adoptive family. Much later, at the birth of her first child, the hospital reported the birth to the Children's Aid Society as a result of the birth alert on her health file. Children's Aid came to take the child, suggesting that she didn't have parenting skills because she was a survivor of the 60 scoop. Luckily, her adoptive family was present and argued against this assessment, and she was allowed to keep her child. Clearly, these intimate connections between hospitals and Child and Family Services are ongoing even now that birth alerts have apparently been ended in Ontario. At this point, it is uncertain whether birth alerts in Ontario are terminated only for new births or if birth alerts on previous files remain despite this apparent change in policy. These multiple experiences leave Indigenous people with a mistrust and fear of the hospital, leading to avoidance in most cases.
The outcome of that is that I was afraid of the hospital. I luckily never had to have surgery since then. If I had to, I would be afraid and I would want to be served somewhere else. I definitely wouldn't want to go back to the hospital. I would probably delay my care too. I wouldn't go unless I really, really had to.
If I ever have to go to a hospital, I'll go to Gananoque or any other place but KGH until they learn how to treat us better. I'm left with a lot of distrust and anger. I don't go anymore to the hospital. I refuse to go now. I don't trust them. I go to Kingston Community Health Center, KCHC. I trust the doctors there. They have an Indigenous grandmother that supports patients. They have no one in any of the different fields at KGH except for the cancer clinic.
I did not feel comfortable returning to the ER after that experience, even though I had not yet developed a strong understanding of racism other than my lived experience. I still didn't feel comfortable returning. I'm afraid I'm going to meet a nurse or whoever is triaging who will be angry at me because I'm there, or so I might potentially not receive care. I definitely wouldn't want to return to the ER. Maybe a different one, but definitely not that one.
The outcome of these experiences demonstrate a consistent level of inadequate care or no care. Experiences in the KGH and Hotel Dieu Hospital have led Indigenous peoples to avoid the hospital except in dire circumstances, and then only with a support person. Several individuals stated they would never attend Kingston General Hospital without bringing friends, those who are white or were comfortable in dealing with administrators or were actual hospital staff to act as witnesses. Those who themselves were white passing have indicated a reluctance to identify as Indigenous because of their knowledge that being identified as Indigenous can result in their receiving a much poorer level of health care, as well as being targeted for stereotypes and microaggressions. A range of ideas were presented by participants regarding how to change the system in order to make it safer for Indigenous clients. Anti-racism training and the need for recognition of racism as an ongoing problem that they themselves carry forward was suggested as opposed to cultural sensitivity training, which has been found to be ineffective. Another said that there was a need to be actually punished when a healthcare provider is accused of racism by more than one client.
They always go through crappy stuff like cultural sensitivity training, and that's not what they need. They need to be confronted with the fact that they are racist. They need to grow up enough to admit that they are racist. It's not going to take cultural sensitivity training.
I would recommend sensitivity, cultural, trauma, and other training to help with those who use drugs for mental pain. My niece should not be dead, and I hold the hospitals partly responsible.
Another suggestion was to develop a structural plan to address anti-Indigenous racism within the hospital.
Because it's happening at so many levels, even just in my experience, we know at least it's happening in the KGH, ER, and OR, and triage. And we know also from literature that it's taking place at every single level in the hospital. But there are hot spots too, because in ER with triage, they decide how important it is that you get in. So that would be a place that KGH specifically would need to address racism generally, but anti-Indigenous racism specifically. I want this overall plan for every department in the hospital.
This was backed up with the idea of the need for an advisory committee with the power to effect change.
Hospitals should have some kind of Indigenous advisory committee that actually has power in the governing structure, and the power part is important. That's another one I'd suggest because they could make change across the organization.
A good system of reporting on harmful experiences was also suggested.
If there's a good system where people can report back and say, this was my experience, being asked, would you like to report back on how you were treated? And one of those questions should be about, did you experience racism, racist microaggressions?
There needs to be a proper complaint process with outside investigators for Indigenous hospital complaints.
Another participant suggested that there needs to be appropriate guidelines for how to behave with patients.
I think that there are ways that the doctor could have talked to me, and that was not the ideal way.
This extends to the approach to people who may be drug users.
Even if I was an intravenous drug user, I shouldn't be yelled at after coming out of surgery. That's the bottom line. It doesn't matter whether I was or wasn't. I wasn't, but even if I was, I don't think doctors should be yelling at you after surgery. I think you should still be receiving adequate care if you are an intravenous drug user. A lot of Indigenous people are, because of our history and trauma, and a lot of reasons. I think we should all be receiving adequate care regardless of what kind of substances that we're using.
An important suggestion was that there needs to be more patient navigators and Indigenous spiritual care providers to assist patients through the process of care, as they have the backing of the hospital and they would have a greater weight behind them. Another participant noted the need for translators. Lastly, one participant drew the analogy between racism and sexual misconduct in terms of their effect on the person, causing avoidance and withdrawal from the process and those they see as harmful.
Racism is at least as bad as sexual misconduct. They are responsible for genocide, and the only reason that it's as bad is that the people who are in charge of laws are white, and they don't consider that every negative stat in this country show that the harm to life of consequences of racism to such a degree that absolutely it should be considered as bad as sexual misconduct.
This last comment speaks to the severity of the issue and the impact on Indigenous clients, such that it will be treated as comparable to sexual misconduct. However, it is important to note that sexual violence has been a central aspect of racism in Canada for centuries, and still is, as the report of the Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and LGBTQ2S people has indicated. The outcome of this research suggests a number of ideas for change. While there was less consensus about the need for sensitivity training in favor of anti-racism training, with particular emphasis on stereotypes about Indigenous peoples and drugs and alcohol. One individual suggested the importance of translators for students who are elderly and who are not fluent in English. 3 solutions commonly addressed were as follows. 1. Indigenous patient navigators to guide individuals through their treatment. 2. Elders to provide comfort and guidance for those at times of illness. And 3. Advisory committees that can hear complaints about medical staff and are empowered to seek results at the highest level. Finally, given that 2 out of 9 interviewed experienced problems with Child and Family Services, an investigation into the current relationship between Kingston hospitals and Child and Family Services is fundamentally needed. We need to know whether birth alerts, which were supposed to have been abolished in October 2020, are still used retroactively for those who have already had birth alerts in the past, and why Child and Family Services are still being called so easily in response to stereotypes which have been prevalent since residential schooling about the parenting abilities of First Nations women.